Man gives lift to mysterious woman hitchhiking in rain. Next day, a millionaire family feud unfolds, with a helicopter hovering over his house. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Rain drummed against the windshield in relentless rhythm, so loud it nearly drowned out the low strains of music playing through Callum's old speakers. The storm was fierce, a wall of gray that made visibility difficult, but it wasn't what kept his mind distracted tonight. It was the woman beside him, silent as shadows, watching the rain streak down the passenger window. Callum had been halfway home from his second job when he saw her standing by the roadside, drenched and looking half lost. He almost hadn't stopped. But something, a quiet instinct born from years as a private investigator, had urged him to pull over and at least ask if she was okay. When she'd accepted his offer, sliding into the seat and murmuring a polite thanks, he hadn't expected her to stay so quiet. She hadn't offered much information, just her name, Renata. No mention of why she'd been out there alone or where her car had been. Her clothes, wet and clinging, gave her a waifish look, but her eyes held a quiet intensity that belied any fragility. She had a way of watching the road, the shadows flickering across her face, that made Callum suspect she wasn't as helpless as she looked. He cleared his throat, attempting to break the silence. "Hell of a night to be out here," he remarked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Car trouble, huh?" Renata nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yes. Battery died. Tried to fix it, but," she trailed off, a slight shrug suggesting she didn't care to elaborate. "Bad luck," he replied, his gaze shifting to the road. "Can't imagine there are many cars passing through here this time of night." She glanced at him briefly, her eyes dark and cautious. "No. I thought I might end up walking all the way back to town." The way she said it, her voice as clipped and cautious as her gaze, made him curious. It wasn't that she was lying, Callum had spent enough years reading people to know she wasn't, but there was something she was holding back, something she wasn't saying. He'd met his share of people with secrets, and she had the look of someone who'd been keeping one for too long. They fell back into silence, the car filling with the quiet hum of the engine and the muffled sound of rain. Callum turned up the radio, tuning it to a classic rock station. An old song filtered through the speakers, a familiar tune he hadn't heard in years. It had been one of his younger brother's favorites, and the memory tugged at him, sharp and sudden. It was funny how a song could do that, take you back to a time and place as if it had only been yesterday. He hadn't planned on saying anything, but the words slipped out before he could stop himself. "My brother loved this song. Played it non-stop." He paused, feeling a little foolish for bringing it up. "Drove me crazy back then. Miss it now, though." Renata turned, her gaze softening as she studied him. "Your brother," she said quietly. "You were close?" "Yeah. Real close," he replied, feeling the familiar ache surface, a wound he'd thought had scarred over. "Lost him a few years back. Cancer. He was too young." The car filled with the weight of unspoken words, the sadness settling between them in the soft dark. Renata's expression softened, and for a moment, he thought she might say something. But she simply offered a small nod, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Loss like that, it never leaves, does it?" "No, it doesn't," he replied, his voice low. And just like that, he realized he wasn't the only one carrying something heavy tonight. He could feel it in her silence, in the way she seemed to pull herself inward, as if there were things inside her she didn't want the world to see. "Funny how music brings memories back," she said, more to herself than to him. Her gaze drifted to the window, watching the rain slide down in sheets. "Sometimes, it's like, it takes you right back to a place, whether you want to go or not." He nodded, letting the quiet stretch between them. There was something about her words, her tone, that made him wonder just what she was carrying, what memories she was trying to keep at bay. So, he ventured after a pause, I told you a little about myself. Your turn. A faint smile tugged at her lips, though her eyes held a guarded gleam. Not much to tell, she replied lightly, a practiced ease in her voice that didn't quite mask the evasiveness. Just passing through. Right. He let it go, but his instincts pricked at him. She wasn't being dishonest, she just wasn't giving the full story. If you're passing through, he added, watching her, you picked a strange time to get caught on a back road like this. Renata shrugged, her gaze slipping to the window. Sometimes, you end up places you don't expect. There was a sadness in her words, a quiet resignation he recognized. He didn't push, he'd learned a long time ago that people only opened up when they were ready. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, letting the silence fill the car once more, broken only by the soft strains of music and the patter of rain. They drove on, the town lights growing closer, casting a faint glow against the dark sky. The storm had eased, the rain thinning to a mist as they turned down a quiet street lined with old houses. Renata sat up, her gaze scanning the road, and after a moment, she motioned for him to pull over. Here's good, she said, her voice soft but resolute. Callum slowed, glancing at her with a hint of surprise. You sure? I don't mind taking you closer. She shook her head, a polite but firm smile crossing her face. Thank you, Callum. This is more than enough. He nodded, stopping by the curb. She reached for the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to him. Her face softened, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something like gratitude in her eyes, a spark of warmth that chased away the guarded look she'd worn all night. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. For the ride. And, for sharing. Anytime, Renata, he replied, giving her a small smile. Take care of yourself. Callum hadn't been able to shake the image of Renata disappearing into the mist. There was something about her, something that left him feeling like he'd missed an essential part of the story. He drove home in silence, the wipers rhythmically sweeping across his windshield, pushing the drizzle aside. As he reached over to the passenger seat to toss the towel into the back, his fingers brushed against something cool and hard. Frowning, he picked it up, a small metal key, ornate and slightly tarnished, resting in his palm like a question waiting to be answered. He turned it over, studying the intricate designs on its surface. The patterns looked almost like symbols, unfamiliar and strange, as if they held some secret meaning. Strange, he murmured, pocketing the key as he drove off into the mist, the image of Renata and the feel of cold metal lingering in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. In the dim light of his porch, Callum held the key up, examining the delicate, swirling designs on the handle. They looked like symbols from some other time, a language or a story etched in metal. It made him wonder what kind of door or chest it might open, and why Renata, who'd seemed determined to leave with no traces behind, had left it there by accident. Or had it been an accident? For a moment, he entertained the idea that she'd left it on purpose, a quiet call for him to look deeper. But that seemed unlikely. Renata had been too guarded, her defenses so carefully in place that he doubted she'd let anything slip intentionally. No, this was just a coincidence, he told himself, a remnant of a chance encounter with a stranger on a stormy night. Still, it was odd. The mystery of it tugged at him, reminding him of old cases he'd worked, back when curiosity was more than a habit, it was his livelihood. But he was done with that life now. He had to remind himself of that as he tucked the key back into his pocket and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Later that evening, as he sat in his small kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, he found his gaze drifting back to the key. It lay on the table beside him, an unassuming relic casting small shadows across the wood grain. Callum reached for it, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of its mystery settle into his bones. Just a key, he murmured to himself, willing the allure of it to fade. He set it down and tried to focus on the things he usually enjoyed, the soft hum of his radio, the pages of a well-worn book he'd started rereading. But every so often, his eyes drifted back to the key, its presence unshakable, like a whisper he couldn't quite ignore. In the end, sleep claimed him late, and when it did, it was filled with images of Renata's face, her gaze unreadable, the key clutched in her hand like a secret she couldn't bear to share. The next morning, Callum was barely out of bed, squinting against the early light as he brewed his first cup of coffee, when the sound of helicopter blades shattered the morning calm. The dull thrum grew louder, rattling his windows and sending the birds outside scattering. He stepped to the window, cup in hand, watching as a sleek black helicopter descended toward his front yard, its rotors kicking up a cloud of dust and leaves. "What on earth?" he muttered, setting his coffee down as a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Before he could fully process the scene, the helicopter touched down, and 3 men in dark suits disembarked, moving with the unhurried purpose of people who didn't need to explain themselves. Callum recognized their type instantly: professional, unreadable, and likely armed. One of the men approached his front door and knocked, each rap firm and even, as if he had all the time in the world. Callum took a deep breath, ran a hand through his hair, and opened the door, his face calm though his mind was racing. "Callum Hayes?" The man's voice was clipped, businesslike. He didn't wait for a response. "We're here on behalf of Renata Moretti. We understand you provided her assistance last night?" "Moretti," Callum repeated, as if tasting the name for the first time. He'd only known her as Renata, no last name given. "She didn't tell me much, but yeah, I gave her a ride when her car broke down." The man nodded, looking as though this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Good. Renata Moretti is a person of interest. She belongs to an influential family, and her activities often attract attention." Callum raised an eyebrow, feigning nonchalance as he leaned against the doorframe. "Can't say I know much about her. Gave her a lift and dropped her off where she asked, that's it." The man's gaze didn't waver, his expression unreadable. "We would advise caution, Mr. Hayes. People who associate with Miss Moretti occasionally find themselves entangled in matters that are complicated." With that, the man handed him a card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. "If she contacts you again, call this number. And remember our advice." Without another word, the men turned and strode back to the helicopter, leaving Callum standing in his doorway with a sense of unease crawling up his spine. He watched them take off, the roar of the rotors fading as quickly as it had come. It was only when he was back inside, holding the stark white card between his fingers, that he felt the full weight of the encounter. Whoever Renata was, she was clearly wrapped up in something big. Barely 20 minutes later, there was another knock on his door, lighter and more familiar. He opened it to find Renata standing there, though this time she was transformed. Gone were the damp clothes and guarded expression. Instead, she was dressed in an elegantly tailored suit, her hair styled in soft waves, a quiet confidence replacing her previous wariness. "Good morning, Callum," she said, a wry smile curving her lips. "I suppose I owe you a proper introduction. You can start by explaining why half a military crew just landed in my yard," he replied, crossing his arms. "They seemed very interested in you, Miss Moretti." She laughed, a sound that held an edge of weariness. "Ah, yes. I should have expected that." She looked at him directly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I come from a rather prominent family. The Morettis. You've probably never heard of us, but in certain circles, the name means a great deal." "Clearly," he replied, gesturing to his yard, still marked by the helicopter's landing. "Care to explain what those circles are? And why they're watching you?" She hesitated, her face growing serious. "I was conducting a search last night, a personal one. My family owns several historical artifacts, heirlooms that are supposed to be priceless, not just in monetary value but in historical significance. However, there's another branch of the family who claims ownership, and they're competitive about it." Callum watched her closely, absorbing her words and the unspoken implications that hung between them. So you're not just looking for family keepsakes. This is about legacy, isn't it? Legacy, power, and more money than I care to think about, she confirmed. These artifacts were hidden generations ago after a feud between our families. They were stashed away to keep them from being split in the inheritance, and finding them has become a bit of an obsession for some. He nodded, trying to ignore the persistent thrum of curiosity gnawing at him. So why involve me, Renata? I don't think I fit in with these certain circles. Because you helped me last night when you didn't have to. And because I could use someone I trust. She met his gaze, her expression earnest. I'd like to offer you a reward for last night's help, Callum. I know this has already disrupted your life, and I want to make it right. Thanks, but no thanks, he replied, shaking his head. I'm not in this for money. What I'd really like to know is who's after you, and why they seem willing to go to such lengths. She smiled, though there was little humor in it. The other branch of my family. The Rossi branch. They believe they have as much claim to the artifacts as I do, and they've been persistent. Callum's mind was already working, the gears of his PI instincts clicking into place as he pieced together the hints she'd dropped. The Rossi family, the artifact, the territorial feud. He didn't have all the details, but he knew enough to understand this wasn't a small matter. He could walk away, leave her to sort it out, but some part of him, the part that had spent years unraveling mysteries and finding answers, felt drawn to her story, her cause. After a moment's silence, Renata tilted her head, studying him. I could use your help, Callum, she said softly. I know you're retired, but your skills, they could make a difference. He took a deep breath, weighing the decision. Retirement had been meant as a reprieve from danger, a chance to finally put his own life in order. But his finances were thin, his world quieter than he'd ever expected. Maybe he'd grown a little too comfortable, too willing to let the thrill of a real challenge pass him by. All right, he said, finally nodding. I'll help you. But only if you give me the full story and tell me exactly what I'm walking into. Renata's face softened, her expression one of genuine relief. Deal, she replied, her voice warm with gratitude. Thank you, Callum. I promise, whatever happens, I'll make sure you know exactly what's at stake. The morning light filtered through the window as Callum leaned back in his worn leather chair, watching Renata across the small room. She seemed at ease for the first time since he'd met her, like the polished veneer she wore had started to crack, allowing the real story to surface. Her gaze drifted out the window, as if searching for words that could make sense of a decades-old feud now dragging her into dangerous waters. She took a slow breath, turning her attention back to him. The heirlooms, she began, her voice quieter now, are worth more than just the dollar amount assigned to them. They're part of our family's history. Rare artifacts, each with a story, a place in our family's past. They were handed down from generation to generation, until my great-grandfather decided to split them. Callum's eyes narrowed, already sensing the outline of conflict. Split them between who? She sighed, a mixture of frustration and resignation. Two branches of our family, the Morettis and the Rossis. My great-grandfather intended to divide the heirlooms equally. But as he was preparing to make the split, an argument broke out. Accusations flew, old grudges resurfaced, and everything fell apart. And instead of splitting the heirlooms, he hid them away? Callum asked, surprised by the lengths a family would go to protect material legacy. Precisely, Renata nodded. He refused to let either side have them. Instead, he gave instructions to my grandfather, who devised a way to conceal the artifacts, leaving only cryptic clues about where they might be found. But after my grandfather passed, the clues were lost, at least until recently. Callum's curiosity sharpened. What changed recently? Renata's gaze turned steely, a flicker of defiance lighting her features. A letter. I found it among my late father's belongings. It mentioned a location, the estate where we're headed today. I believe it's the first of several sites my grandfather chose to hide the heirlooms. Callum considered this, the wheels in his mind already turning. So, if you know the first location, why haven't you gone there already? I tried, she replied, frustration clear in her voice. But the Rossies got wind of it. They know about the heirlooms, and they're just as desperate to claim them. They've already sent people after me, following me wherever I go, even sending threats. That's why I ended up on that back road the night you found me. I'd been scouting a location when my car broke down, and I had to get out of there fast. He absorbed her words, the reality of her situation settling over him like a weight. This wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was a battle rooted in a bitter legacy, with both sides ready to stake their claim, whatever it took. And now he was tangled in the middle of it. So, this estate, Callum said, folding his arms. It's supposed to hold one of these heirlooms, maybe more? Renata nodded, her expression resolute. It's our best lead, and probably the only solid one we have. The letter mentioned something about a hidden chamber within the walls. My grandfather's instructions were poetic and difficult to interpret. But if the heirlooms are there, I need to find them before the Rossies do. There was a tension in her voice, an urgency that underscored every word. She wasn't just in this for the heirlooms. No, Callum thought, it was more than that. She was driven by a need to reclaim something that had been taken from her, a piece of her family's history, a legacy tarnished by rivalry. They're already on to you, Renata, he said, his tone cautious. And it sounds like they won't let you get far if they have anything to say about it. I know, she replied, a hard glint in her eye. But that's why I need someone who knows how to handle himself. Someone who understands that what we're up against isn't just a scavenger hunt. It's a race against people willing to do whatever it takes. He considered the weight of her words, the implications clear. This wouldn't be a simple search, and it wouldn't end when they found the first artifact. Still, some part of him, the part that missed the rush, the thrill of a good chase, felt drawn to her cause. All right, he finally said. I'm in. But I need to know everything. Every detail, every clue. If I'm going to help you, we're not cutting corners. A faint smile softened her expression, a look of gratitude mingled with relief. You have my word, Callum. Their drive to the estate felt long, the countryside stretching out in rolling fields and dense patches of trees that blurred past as Callum navigated the winding roads. Renata sat beside him, her attention fixed on a small leather-bound journal she'd brought, flipping through its pages with a concentrated frown. After a while, she handed it to him, letting him skim through her grandfather's cryptic instructions. It's maddening, isn't it? She said, her voice laced with frustration. The writing was archaic, filled with flowery prose that seemed more suited to a riddle than a guide. It referenced the Chamber of Shadows, a phrase Callum assumed might refer to a hidden room, and lines about a key to the past. I don't suppose he thought about a simple map, Callum remarked dryly, his eyes narrowing over the ornate phrases. Renata shook her head, a rueful smile on her lips. Apparently, he wanted it to be difficult enough that only someone in the family could figure it out. They reached the estate by mid-afternoon, a sprawling property surrounded by high stone walls, half swallowed by ivy and overgrown foliage. The main house was large and imposing, with thick stone columns framing the entrance and a slightly crumbling facade that hinted at years of neglect. They parked by a side gate, out of sight, both moving quietly as they approached the estate. Renata glanced over her shoulder, a wary look passing over her face as she scanned the grounds. The Rossies aren't here, at least not yet, she murmured. But we'll have to move fast. The estate loomed large and imposing against the gray sky, its stones darkened with age, ivy creeping along the walls like old secrets hidden in plain sight. Callum and Renata stood just beyond the gate, taking in the quiet grandeur of the place. It had once belonged to her family, a silent witness to generations of Morettus. Now it seemed almost alive with tension, like the house itself knew what they'd come for, and what awaited them inside. The gate creaked open, and they stepped onto the overgrown pathway, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound as they moved closer. Renata reached for her small leather-bound journal, the pages filled with scrawled notes and fragments from her grandfather's letters. According to this, the first clue should be inside the library, she said, flipping to a page that held a roughly sketched map of the estate's interior. It mentioned something about a room of echoes, which I think might refer to the high ceilings and acoustics in there. Callum raised an eyebrow. Room of echoes? Subtle. He looked up at the sprawling house, noting the intricate carvings above the door, a pair of snakes, intertwined, each staring in opposite directions. It was a symbol he'd seen in her journal as well, mentioned in her grandfather's notes as a sort of protective emblem. Ready? Renata nodded, clutching the journal close. Let's just hope we're alone. The entryway was cool and dim, the air carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. Callum took in the grand staircase, the wide hallways, all covered in thick shadows. They passed through to the library, an expansive room lined with shelves crammed with dusty volumes, some bound in leather so worn they were almost unrecognizable. Renata moved to a far wall, scanning the shelves, her gaze searching for any detail that stood out. Callum joined her, running his fingers along the spines of the books, feeling for any loose panels or hidden mechanisms. Got something, he muttered, finding a thin seam between the shelves, just wide enough to suggest a hidden compartment. Renata knelt beside him, peering into the narrow gap. It's exactly where the letter said it would be, she murmured, a thrill of excitement in her voice. Together, they pried the panel open, revealing a small brass latch. Callum pulled it, and a hidden door swung open, leading into a narrow corridor. That's unexpected, Callum said, glancing down the dimly lit passageway. The walls were lined with old ledgers, each labeled in looping script. Renata's eyes widened as she scanned the titles. These are family records, she whispered, reaching out to trace a name on the spine. They date back centuries. Callum grabbed one of the ledgers, flipping it open to reveal a page covered in neat, handwritten text. The contents were dense, filled with names, dates, and annotations in faded ink. They quickly realized the ledgers were organized by generation, each detailing key events, transactions, and, importantly, locations connected to the family's assets. As they combed through the records, they found frequent references to other properties, estates long sold or abandoned. Each one had a symbol, a code, that neither of them could decipher. Callum's instincts kicked in, his experience in investigation telling him there was a pattern here, though it was cleverly disguised. They worked in silence, each trying to piece together the meaning of the symbols when Renata stopped, a page in her ledger catching her attention. Look at this, she said, pointing to an entry that mentioned a location named Raven's Hollow, along with a faint sketch of what looked like the estate's layout, symbols dotted throughout it. It's a map, Callum said, realizing that the symbols marked certain areas within the estate. Or at least part of one. Excitement flashed in her eyes, but Callum noted the slight tremor in her hand. She wasn't just excited, she was nervous. This is it, she whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and fear. If we follow this, it should lead us to the chamber. But as they moved back toward the library, something caught Callum's eye. A dusty footprint on the floor, large, heavy, and fresh. We're not alone, he murmured, gesturing to the print. Renata followed his gaze, her expression tightening. They continued through the library, each step careful and silent as they made their way down a hallway lined with portraits, old Morettus and Rossi's staring down at them with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The corridor led to a smaller room, a study of sorts, filled with yet more books and cabinets. There was a window slightly ajar, and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the air. Callum looked over at Renata, a warning in his gaze. They were here recently. Whoever it was, they were looking for the same thing. Her eyes narrowed, determination hardening her features. They must have left empty-handed, or they'd be gone by now. Just then, a faint click sounded from down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices. They froze, Callum motioning for her to stay quiet as they listened. "Did you check the library?" a man's voice asked, rough and impatient. "Yes," another voice replied, this one smoother, with an edge of authority. "But I think the girl's already here. I saw her car near the south gate." Callum's heart quickened. They had to move, and fast. He pointed toward the hidden corridor, pulling her with him as they slipped inside. They pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath as the footsteps approached, the voices growing louder. "What's the plan if we find her?" the rough-voiced man asked, his words sharp, eager. "Keep her occupied," came the cold response. "Our orders are to get the information, whatever it takes." Renata's face went pale, her eyes flicking to Callum, who met her gaze with a steady, reassuring look. He gestured for them to keep moving down the passageway, the distant voices now behind them. At the end of the passage, they found another door, leading into what must have been an old storage room. It was cramped and dark, the shelves lined with dusty crates, and the walls were covered in intricate carvings, snakes, twisting vines, and symbols identical to those in the journal. "This must be it," Renata whispered, her voice barely audible. The room felt dense, alive with the weight of history. Callum looked around, his mind quickly processing the carvings. They matched the symbols on the map, each marking a step in a path that led to a single, circular carving on the floor. He knelt, examining it, brushing the dust away. "This is it," he said. "This symbol, it's different. It might be the entrance to the chamber." Renata joined him, her fingers tracing the symbol's outline. She pressed down, and with a low, grinding sound, the floor shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small, ornately carved box, its surface lined with gold and jewels, glinting even in the dim light. Renata lifted it, her face a mixture of relief and awe. "They're here," she murmured, holding the box close. "The heirlooms." But just as they were about to close the compartment, footsteps sounded from the hallway, loud and close. "Run," Callum whispered urgently, pulling her toward a second exit he'd spotted. The hidden compartment opened with a dull creak, the scent of old stone and aged wood escaping like a ghost released from a tomb. Callum knelt down, holding his flashlight steady as he took in the sight before him. There, nestled in the hollowed floor of the abandoned wine cellar, were several small, ornately crafted chests. Each was lined with intricate carvings and metalwork, the handles worn from years of use, but the craftsmanship still breathtaking. Renata's breath caught as she knelt beside him, her hand covering her mouth as she absorbed the sight. "They're real," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and awe. "They actually survived all this time." "Seems your grandfather knew what he was doing when he hid them away," Callum said, his voice low, respectful of the history encapsulated in each chest. He glanced at Renata, seeing a glint of emotion in her eyes, a reflection of the weight she must have felt. "Well, let's see what's inside." Together, they lifted the first chest, its weight solid and heavy, and carefully unlatched it. Inside, nestled among faded velvet, lay pieces of jewelry unlike anything Callum had seen, necklaces adorned with gemstones, rings with intricate designs, and bracelets of finely braided gold. Each piece was a masterpiece, evidence of a time when artistry mattered as much as the materials themselves. "These belonged to my great-grandmother," Renata murmured, reaching out to touch a delicate emerald pendant. She was said to have inherited them from her mother. "I remember seeing sketches of these in an old album, but I never thought I'd actually see them in person." Callum nodded, understanding the depth of what this meant to her. These weren't just heirlooms, they were tangible pieces of her family's legacy, lost to the quarrels of time and preserved in secrecy. They moved to the next chest, which revealed a collection of antique weaponry, a dagger with a carved ivory handle, a flintlock pistol embellished with silver, and a set of small, perfectly balanced throwing knives. Each piece was a testament to both beauty and lethality, designed with painstaking attention to detail. "Not your everyday family heirlooms," Callum noted, lifting the dagger and feeling its weight. "Your ancestors had interesting tastes." Renata laughed, the sound soft and bittersweet. They weren't the peaceful kind, that's for sure. Family history is full of duels, battles, and enough grudges to fill volumes. Callum set the dagger down and opened the third chest, this one containing a stack of aged documents and manuscripts. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, but each page bore the telltale marks of careful preservation. They were written in Italian, the handwriting elegant and flowing, though difficult to decipher. Renata leaned over, squinting at one of the titles, her eyes widening. "These are letters," she said, barely above a whisper. "Correspondence between my grandfather and his brother, written before the feud. They might explain why the family fell apart in the first place." Callum's curiosity deepened. These letters, worn and faded as they were, could be the very foundation of the feud that had divided the Morettis and the Rossis, forcing generations into bitter rivalry. He felt the weight of their discovery settle over him, the understanding that they held something far greater than mere wealth. They carefully documented the contents of each chest, taking photographs and making notes, knowing they'd need evidence if there was ever a legal battle over ownership. Renata moved with reverence, her hands steady as she catalogued each item, as though handling these objects made her part of something larger, a bridge between the past and the present. After finishing with the chests, they packed them securely, checking twice to make sure each piece was safely stored. But just as they were closing the last chest, Callum noticed a small latch hidden beneath one of the velvet linings. "Hold on," he said, lifting the fabric to reveal the latch. He pressed it, and a hidden compartment in the base of the chest popped open. Inside was a single, tarnished key, different from the one Renata had left in Callum's car, yet unmistakably part of the same set. The handle was carved with similar swirling patterns, symbols that hinted at mystery and secrecy. "Another key," Renata whispered, her fingers brushing over it. "I wonder what it's for." "Looks like your grandfather was thorough in hiding his secrets," Callum replied, tucking the key safely into his pocket. "Whatever it unlocks, I'd bet it's something he didn't want just anyone finding." Renata nodded, her expression one of determination. "If it's anything like the rest of these, it could be another piece of our family's history." They carefully secured the chests and headed back up through the winding corridors of the estate, navigating each narrow staircase and hidden passage with a sense of purpose. The air was thick with dust and the lingering chill of the stone walls, but there was a renewed energy between them, a quiet understanding that they were on the verge of something monumental. When they finally emerged into the open air, Renata took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping across the grounds with a look of quiet satisfaction. The estate, once a place filled with mystery and tension, now held a sense of closure, as if her family's story had come full circle within its walls. But Callum wasn't quite at ease. As they loaded the chests into the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, shadows flickering just beyond the tree line. He glanced back at the estate, his instincts alert, but the grounds were silent, unmoving. "Hold on," he whispered to Renata, raising a hand as he scanned the tree line surrounding the estate. The forest was quiet, too quiet. In the fading light, shapes began to materialize from the trees, several men, dressed in dark clothes, their eyes locked on Callum and Renata. At the head of the group was a tall man with strikingly dark hair and a smirk that seemed etched into his face. He held his hands up, casual, but there was nothing friendly about his stance. Well, the man said, voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Renata Moretti. I was hoping we wouldn't have to come to this, but here we are. You have something that belongs to my family." Renata straightened, her chin lifting, but Callum could see the tension tightening her shoulders. She took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "You're trespassing on private property, Paolo. Leave now, or I'll have the police handle this." Paolo, undoubtedly a Rossi, laughed, a sharp, grating sound that grated against the silence. "Oh, please. Let's not pretend you're the only one with a claim here. You know as well as I do that those artifacts are part of the Rossi legacy as much as yours. Legacy doesn't entitle you to theft, Callum interjected, his tone cool as he stepped forward, placing himself between Paolo and Renata. Paolo's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Callum. "And who might you be?" he sneered. "Another hired hand trying to play protector?" "Let's say I'm not one for bullies," Callum replied, his gaze steady. "And I think it's best you and your friends turn around and leave before this gets ugly." Paolo's eyes flicked to the car, catching sight of the chests, and his expression hardened. "Ugly? Oh, I don't think you realize just how ugly this can get." He signaled to the men flanking him, and they stepped forward, closing the distance with slow, calculated movements. Renata's hand found Callum's arm, her voice a whisper. "They won't back down, Callum. The Rossis are ruthless when they want something." He nodded, mind racing, already planning their escape. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't get it." Without warning, Paolo lunged forward, reaching for the car door handle, but Callum was faster. He grabbed Paolo's wrist, twisting it sharply. Paolo stumbled back, his face a mix of surprise and anger, but he quickly recovered, eyes flashing with fury. "That was a mistake," Paolo hissed, signaling to the men around him. "Take them. And make sure you get those chests." In an instant, the quiet of the estate exploded into chaos. The men charged, scattering leaves and kicking up dust as they closed in. Callum pushed Renata back, yelling for her to head toward the trees. She didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the cover of the forest as Callum held off the closest of Paolo's men with a sharp elbow jab, sending the man staggering. "Go," he shouted, following her, his senses on high alert. They darted into the woods, the shadows quickly enveloping them, but the sounds of footsteps and breaking branches told him the Rossis weren't far behind. Renata was fast, navigating through the dense underbrush with surprising agility, but Callum knew they couldn't keep this up for long. The Rossis were gaining on them, and the darkness would only give them a small advantage. "Keep low," he whispered, catching up to her as they ducked behind a thick tree. "We need to lose them. Circle around if we can and double back." Renata nodded, her face determined despite the fear in her eyes. She glanced around, spotting a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, partially concealed by fallen branches. "This way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They moved silently, stepping carefully to avoid making noise, the shouts of the Rossi men fading slightly as they continued in the wrong direction. Callum felt his pulse slowing, hope rising as he realized they might actually lose them, if they were careful. But just as they neared a clearing, the crack of a branch behind them made them freeze. Callum turned, catching sight of Paolo, flanked by two men, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Did you really think you could outrun us?" Paolo sneered, his voice cutting through the quiet. "This forest is practically my backyard." "Funny, I didn't take you for a nature lover," Callum replied, his voice calm despite the rapid beat of his heart. Paolo smirked, gesturing for his men to move closer. "Hand over the heirlooms, Renata. This doesn't have to be difficult." Renata stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You think you deserve them? After everything the Rossis have done to tear our family apart?" "Oh, please spare me the lecture," Paolo said, rolling his eyes. "This is about what belongs to us, not some ancient family drama." While he was distracted, Callum sized up their options. The forest was dense, with plenty of cover if they moved quickly enough, and he noticed an embankment not far off. It was steep, and the ground below looked rocky, but it might be their best chance. Without a word, he took Renata's hand, pulling her toward the edge of the embankment. She glanced at him, surprised, but understood immediately. Together, they scrambled down the steep slope, slipping and stumbling over rocks and tangled roots. Paolo shouted in frustration, his men struggling to follow without losing their balance. At the bottom, Callum and Renata ducked into the cover of a thicket, pausing to catch their breath. The forest had grown darker, the last rays of sunlight barely penetrating the dense foliage. Above them, they could hear Paolo's men crashing through the underbrush, but it sounded as though they'd lost sight of them. "Stay close," Callum whispered, pulling Renata deeper into the woods, keeping his steps light and deliberate. They moved in silence, their path winding through narrow trails and hidden clearings, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged onto a small gravel path that led back toward the estate. Their car was still where they'd left it, the chests untouched in the back seat, the dark forest now a silent sentinel to what had just transpired. Callum opened the door, glancing back once more to make sure they hadn't been followed. He slid into the driver's seat, waiting until Renata was safely inside before starting the engine. As they drove away, he cast a glance in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of Paolo and his men emerging from the edge of the forest, their faces furious, defeated. Renata leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "That was close." Callum nodded, his hands tight on the wheel. "Too close. They're not giving up. Not by a long shot." She looked at him, her expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready for them. They may have a claim, but that doesn't mean they're right. Those heirlooms belong with my family." Callum met her gaze, seeing the determination there, a fierceness that reminded him why he'd agreed to help her in the first place. "Then let's make sure they stay yours," he said, the quiet promise lingering between them as they sped away from the estate, leaving the Rossis and their threats in the shadows where they belonged. Back in the city, Renata and Callum stepped into the bright, polished office of an appraiser, the chests of heirlooms carefully carried by two assistants. The office was decorated with gleaming cases filled with fine art and artifacts, each one carrying the same sheen of old-world grandeur that now defined the treasures they'd brought. Callum watched as Renata exchanged brief, business-like introductions with the appraiser, an older gentleman with the kind of careful demeanor that suggested he handled million-dollar antiques regularly. They sat down while he began examining each piece, his gloved hands lifting necklaces, rings, and ancient documents, with reverence. Callum felt the weight of the experience sink in as the appraiser let out an impressed hum, nodding as he moved through the collection. They'd been through a lot to get here, and though he felt an urge to be cautious, a part of him was quietly exhilarated, knowing that these heirlooms were now safe, at least for the moment. Finally, the appraiser set down the last item, a ring with an enormous ruby, its color dark and vibrant even in the sterile office light. He removed his gloves, looking up at them with an expression of quiet awe. "I must admit," he said, his voice low and respectful, "this is one of the most remarkable private collections I've seen. These heirlooms are exquisite examples of historical craftsmanship. Their value is, well, astronomical." Renata raised an eyebrow. "Can you give us an idea?" He cleared his throat, running a finger over his notes. "We're looking at an estimated value in the tens of millions, easily. But the true worth lies in the historical value. Each piece carries its own story, its own importance in the context of the era it was crafted. It's the kind of collection that would draw serious interest from collectors worldwide." Callum caught the flicker of emotion in Renata's eyes, pride mixed with something else, something deeper and unresolved. She was clearly pleased, but he knew this wasn't just about money. She was here to reclaim her family's story, to take back what had been lost to secrecy and rivalry. "Thank you," Renata said softly. "That means a lot." Just as they were about to leave, a knock came at the door. The assistant poked his head in, looking hesitant. "Ms. Moretti, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Renata frowned, exchanging a glance with Callum before nodding. "Let him in." The door swung open, and a young man in a tailored suit stepped in, holding a legal file under his arm. He looked both nervous and determined, his gaze steady as he addressed them. "Ms. Moretti, Mr. Hayes. My name is David Martinez. I'm here on behalf of the Rossi family." The moment tensed, a quiet shock settling over the room as David pulled out a thick stack of documents, setting them on the table before Renata. "They're contesting the heirlooms," David explained, his tone formal. The Rossi family has filed an injunction blocking any sale or transfer of the items in question, claiming equal rights to them as part of their family legacy. Renata's eyes hardened. You can't be serious. The Rossis haven't shown a real claim to these heirlooms for generations. They were hidden because of their greed, not to share in the family's history. David nodded, his expression understanding but firm. I realize this is a sensitive matter, Ms. Moretti, but my clients intend to pursue this. They believe these items belong to both branches of the family and should be divided equally. Callum let out a quiet sigh, his gaze steady as he glanced at Renata. This is why they were so intent on tracking us at the estate. They wanted to push this to court. Yes, Mr. Hayes, David replied, his tone neutral. And it appears they're prepared to go to great lengths to see it through. Renata closed her eyes briefly, collecting herself before she turned back to David. Fine. But they'll need more than legal paperwork to prove ownership. These heirlooms belong to the Moretti line, not theirs. David nodded, though his expression remained serious. Then I recommend securing legal assistance, Ms. Moretti. You'll need a strong case, and to be frank, you'll need historical expertise. Without documented proof of sole ownership, this could drag on for years. Later that day, they sat in the quiet of Callum's apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Renata had contacted her family lawyer, a steely woman named Nora, and they were waiting for her call to discuss their next steps. What do you think our chances are? Renata asked, her voice soft but filled with determination. Callum leaned back, considering. I think if we can prove the artifacts were handed down specifically through the Moretti line, you have a strong case. But that's going to require digging into records, finding documentation, things that may have been lost over the years. Renata nodded, her gaze distant. I don't want them to win, Callum. These aren't just objects to me. They're part of my family's identity. He reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. We'll fight this. But we'll need an expert in genealogy, someone who can back up the family's history and uncover anything that could strengthen your claim. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. Nora's name flashed on the screen, and Renata answered, putting the call on speaker. Renata, Callum, it's Nora. I've reviewed the preliminary injunction. The Rossis are claiming equal ownership, but their case is built on shaky grounds. I'd say they're trying to scare you into a settlement. They're not going to scare us off, Renata said, her voice steady. What can we do to strengthen our side? I've already contacted a historian and genealogist who specializes in ancestral claims and old estates. Her name is Dr. Evelyn Marks. If anyone can trace the true ownership of those heirlooms, it's her. I'll arrange a meeting. Relief washed over Callum as he caught Renata's eye. This was the kind of ally they needed, someone who could sort through the layers of family history and piece together the evidence. Thank you, Nora, Renata said. Let's set it up as soon as possible. Consider it done, Nora replied. And stay prepared, both of you. The Rossis are playing hardball, and this isn't going to be easy. 2 days later, they sat across from Dr. Evelyn Marks in her book-lined office, the walls covered with maps and genealogical charts. She was a tall woman with graying hair and sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She listened intently as Renata explained the heirlooms and the long-standing feud between the Morettis and the Rossis. When Renata finished, Dr. Marks nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes. This is a unique case, but not uncommon. I've dealt with family rivalries over estates before, though your story comes with more history than most. Can you help us? Renata asked, her voice earnest. Dr. Marks looked up, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I believe so. My job will be to trace the Moretti lineage and confirm whether the heirlooms were passed exclusively down that line. We'll need to review documents, letters, any family records we can find, and perhaps even conduct interviews with living family members on both sides. Callum nodded, impressed by her thoroughness. And the Rossis? What's stopping them from manufacturing evidence? Dr. Marks's smile hardened. If they try that, I'll catch it. Genealogy isn't just about tracing names. It's about understanding the integrity of records, patterns, and historical context. If they falsify anything, it will stand out. The confidence in her tone gave Callum a flicker of hope. They still had a fight ahead of them, but with Dr. Marks on their side, they had a solid chance. After the meeting, as they walked out into the cool evening air, Renata exhaled deeply, a hint of relief breaking through the tension on her face. It feels good to have someone who knows what they're doing, she said, glancing at Callum. The weeks leading up to the court date were a whirlwind of discoveries and late nights sifting through old records. Dr. Evelyn Marks dove into the Moretti and Rossi family histories with relentless focus, her keen eye uncovering secrets hidden for generations. Each time she unearthed a new piece of evidence, Callum and Renata would feel the mounting tension, the stakes of their battle crystallizing with every piece of the past laid bare. In her office, Evelyn shared the most shocking revelations with them, the pages of old letters and documents fanned out across her desk like a map of betrayals. She leaned over a particularly aged letter, her voice calm but edged with the impact of the contents. This, Evelyn said, tapping a yellowed page, is a letter written by Renata's great-grandfather. It describes the exact moment he decided to hide the heirlooms rather than divide them. Renata leaned in, her breath held as she read the letter's faint script, each word carrying the weight of her family's history. In it, her great-grandfather lamented the greed he saw growing within the Rossi family and their increasingly aggressive attempts to claim more of the family estate. Evelyn continued, her voice steady. He mentioned specifically that the Rossis had already been caught tampering with documents, even bribing a family lawyer in an attempt to secure a larger share of the Moretti holdings. That's why he hid the heirlooms, to ensure they'd remain under Moretti control. The words sank in, each revelation an echo of a past Renata had only vaguely known about, now illuminated in painful detail. Callum watched her closely, knowing this wasn't just about winning a case, it was about reclaiming her family's dignity. What's more, Evelyn added, her expression grave, I found evidence that the Rossis attempted to change the family will several times over the years. Each time, they forged letters or claimed non-existent agreements. It wasn't only about wealth, it was about dominance. Renata nodded, anger flashing in her eyes. They've always believed they could take whatever they wanted, no matter the cost. It's why my family broke ties with them. Callum placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We're ready for this, Renata. The truth is on your side. When the court date finally arrived, Callum could feel the charged atmosphere before they'd even set foot inside. Reporters loitered near the entrance, photographers aiming their lenses as Renata stepped out of the car, her chin high, the weight of her family's legacy carried in her every step. Callum walked beside her, offering silent support as they made their way through the throngs of curious onlookers. Inside, the courtroom was filled with tension. The Rossi family sat across the aisle, their expressions cold, eyes narrowed as they regarded Renata with thinly veiled disdain. Paolo Rossi himself sat in the front row, his arms crossed, a smirk barely contained on his face. The proceedings began, and the lawyers moved through the arguments swiftly. Nora, Renata's lawyer, presented a compelling case, highlighting the Moretti family's long-standing ownership of the heirlooms and the meticulous documentation uncovered by Evelyn. As Nora spoke, Callum could see the judge leaning forward, interest sparked by the family's complex history. But when it came time for Callum to take the stand, the room grew still. He moved to the front with a calm, measured pace, keeping his eyes focused, knowing his testimony would be crucial. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair, meeting Nora's gaze as she began her questions. Mr. Hayes, could you describe the events leading to the discovery of the Moretti heirlooms? He nodded, his voice steady as he spoke. Renata approached me initially because she suspected that a rival family member, Paolo Rossi, was also searching for the heirlooms. We encountered multiple attempts to interfere, including direct threats from Mr. Rossi himself. Despite these threats, we were able to locate the heirlooms in an estate belonging to the Moretti family. Nora nodded, her voice sharp and clear. And in your professional opinion, Mr. Hayes, were there any indications that the Rossis held a legitimate claim to these items? Callum took a breath, his gaze steady as he replied, none. Every document we uncovered and every piece of the family's history pointed to the heirlooms being passed through the Moretti lineage alone. The Rossis showed no documented right to the collection beyond speculative claims. Paolo's lawyer rose, his tone confrontational. Mr. Hayes, you claim there were multiple attempts to interfere. Isn't it possible that you simply misunderstood Mr. Rossi's intentions? Couldn't these encounters have been innocuous? Callum raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but edged with irony. When someone corners you in the woods, issues veiled threats, and tries to physically block your path, I'd say there's very little room for misunderstanding. The judge nodded, his expression neutral but approving, and Paolo's lawyer reluctantly took his seat. When Evelyn took the stand next, she presented her findings with precision. She shared the letters, the ledgers, and the will alterations, laying bare a pattern of manipulation and greed that painted a damning picture of the Rossi family's actions over the years. By the time she stepped down, Callum could feel the air shift, the weight of the evidence settling heavily on the room. Finally, Renata took the stand, her voice steady as she spoke about the personal toll the feud had taken, the isolation her family had faced in choosing integrity over greed. She recounted the night Callum had found her stranded on the side of the road, the risks she'd taken to uncover her family's rightful inheritance. She spoke not only for herself but for her ancestors, her words a testament to their resilience. When the judge finally retired to deliberate, the room held its collective breath. Callum could see Paolo, his face taut, fists clenched as he avoided eye contact with Renata. It was a tense wait, each second feeling stretched as they awaited the decision that would shape the future of both families. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned, his expression composed but carrying a weight that hinted at the significance of his verdict. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and addressed the courtroom. Based on the evidence provided, he began, his voice clear and steady, it is this court's conclusion that the Moretti family has demonstrated a clear and rightful ownership of the heirlooms in question. The claims made by the Rossi family are unsubstantiated and lack the necessary historical basis to justify equal ownership. A collective sigh of relief escaped Callum and Renata, a weight lifting from their shoulders as the judge continued. These items are to remain with the Moretti family, and any future attempts to interfere with this ruling will be met with legal consequences. He glanced briefly at the Rossi side of the courtroom, where Paolo sat, his face frozen with anger. The gavel struck, the sound final and powerful. Callum squeezed Renata's shoulder, pride warming his voice as he whispered, "You did it, Renata. It's yours." She nodded, her eyes glistening as she looked at him, gratitude and relief mingling on her face. "We did it, Callum. Thank you for everything." As they stepped outside, they were met with a wall of flashing cameras, reporters clamoring for a statement. Renata lifted her head, a quiet strength in her expression, and spoke directly to them. "This isn't just about treasure," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It's about family, about protecting the legacy of those who came before us. I'm proud to honor that legacy today." The courtroom victory left Callum and Renata basking in quiet relief. Outside the courthouse, they found a moment of calm amid the lingering crowd and questions, the weight of their triumph settling in. As they left the press and headed back into the city, Renata's expression softened, a thoughtful calm replacing the fierce determination that had carried her through these last intense weeks. Later, back at her family's downtown office, Renata pulled Callum aside, her face lit by the kind of satisfaction that only came with finishing something difficult and long overdue. "Callum," she began, reaching into her bag, "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You didn't just help me find these heirlooms. You helped me reclaim a piece of myself." She smiled, pressing a small leather-bound case into his hands. "This is for you." He opened it, and there, on a bed of deep velvet, lay a delicate, beautifully carved bracelet of gold and emerald. He lifted it, his fingers brushing over the intricate design, realizing with surprise that it wasn't just an heirloom. Nestled beside the bracelet was a generous check, the amount far beyond anything he could have imagined. Renata caught his expression and gave a knowing smile. "It's only right that you have a share of this, Callum. I'm certain my great-grandfather would approve. This isn't just about family, it's about friendship. And you've proven to be one of the best friends I could ask for." For a moment, he was too taken aback to speak. He'd known Renata valued his help, but this gesture went beyond anything he'd expected. Renata, thank you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "You stood by me through everything, and I'll always be grateful. But I have other plans for the rest of the heirlooms. Plans I think my family would be proud of." She walked him down to a meeting room where several of the chests from the estate were laid out, open to reveal their treasures. Callum watched as Renata lifted a glittering necklace, examining the way the stones caught the light before setting it down again. "I'm donating the collection," she announced, her tone thoughtful, almost reflective. "There's a foundation my father once spoke of, one that funds college scholarships for underprivileged students. I'll keep a few pieces to pass down in the family, but the rest will go towards something good, something lasting. These heirlooms were hidden away for too long. They deserve to be part of the world again." Callum felt a swell of respect as he watched her. Renata had wrestled with the weight of legacy, of history, of family pride, and yet she had come through it with a vision of something larger, something that could change lives. "Your family would be proud," he said quietly, and he meant it. She smiled, a warm, contented smile that lit her face with a peace he hadn't seen before. "I think so, too." They said their goodbyes at the foundation's office later that afternoon, after finalizing the donation details. The gratitude in Renata's eyes as they parted was mirrored in his own, a connection forged not just in shared history but in a friendship that had become its own kind of legacy. As Callum drove back to his quiet neighborhood, the city lights giving way to suburban streets, he felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. The weeks had been chaotic, exhilarating, each day a new puzzle, a new piece of the story to uncover. And though he'd relished every moment, he now felt a quiet satisfaction that ran deeper than the thrill of adventure. When he walked through his front door, he placed the bracelet and the check on his kitchen table, letting the house settle around him. The silence was soothing, grounding him in a way that reminded him why he'd retired in the first place. This wasn't just about the adventure, the thrill of solving a mystery, or even the reward. This was about knowing he'd made a difference, that he'd helped someone reclaim what mattered most. In the days that followed, Callum found himself easing back into his routine with a newfound sense of purpose. The morning started early, a quiet walk, a cup of coffee by the window, the city slowly waking around him. But he felt lighter, more at ease, as if helping Renata had helped him, too, giving him the reassurance that he'd made the right choice in retiring, in living life at his own pace. One morning, he pulled the bracelet from the case, studying its delicate artistry, feeling the weight of the metal cool in his palm. He'd always valued the peace of a quiet life, but now it felt as if it had gained new meaning. Retirement, he realized, wasn't about escaping the past, but about making peace with it, with every choice that had led him here. He set the bracelet back down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Renata's generosity, her friendship, her quiet strength, they'd left an indelible mark on him, one that would carry him through whatever lay ahead. Weeks passed, and life returned to its gentle rhythm. Occasionally, he'd receive a postcard from Renata, each one a little piece of her new journey. Sometimes it was a picture of a historical site, a museum, or a quiet countryside village, her notes filled with warm thanks and stories of her travels. She'd taken up a new path, seeking out pieces of history to preserve and share, all while carrying her family's legacy in her heart. One evening, as he sat on his porch, a warm breeze rustling through the trees, Callum realized he felt content in a way he hadn't for years. His life was simple, yes, but it was full. Each quiet moment, each choice he'd made had led him here, to a place where peace wasn't just something he sought but something he'd truly found. The adventure with Renata had been thrilling, and he'd savor those memories for years to come. But now, as he watched the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, he knew his place was here, among the quiet streets, in the gentle hours of morning light and evening calm. The world would carry on, mysteries and stories waiting to be discovered, but he was right where he belonged. Callum leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the warmth of the fading sun wash over him. The world was full of stories, and he'd had his share. Now, he was ready to let them rest, content in the knowledge that he'd done his part. And in the quiet moments that followed, he felt a sense of peace deeper than anything he'd ever known, the kind that came not from what he'd done but from who he'd chosen to be.